Hi Tigers, we're going to carry on a bit more from our book, The Baffling Brain. This is actually the third video I've recorded in a row, so that's why I'm wearing the same clothes for each single video. So, we already learnt about ancient Greece, we learnt about ancient Persia, we learnt about two really interesting people, Imhotep and Ibn Sina. We're also seeing how the brain's getting a bit more understanding about it as we go on as well. So, hopefully, you're starting to pick up some ideas about that as we go through. It's also just quite an interesting book. So let's go on with chapter 4. And chapter 4 is called The French Anatomist, and it is set in Paris, France. Coming out of the spin of the time travel, Clinton staggered, stuck out a hand and steadied himself against the wall. Where are we? Paris, 1881, May said. At the... Are you all right? Clinton looked up at her, but the street and buildings seemed to whirl around him. Instead of answering May, Clinton leaned over, retched, and vomited in the gutter. Then he straightened, feeling a tiny bit better. May stared at him with big brown eyes. This is terrible. You're getting worse. We should go right home. Clinton waved a hand. No quitting. This lecture centres on a mission. Besides, look at it this way. If I get sick at least, I'll be in hospital, right? May put her hands on her hips, sighed and shook her head at him. Ignoring her, Clinton pulled the bell at the next nearest door, where a sign read Hospital Bicêtre. A woman dressed as a maid with a long apron and white cap answered the door, and Clinton saw May quickly turn the XPA translated to French. How can I help you? The maid asked. May said, We would like to talk to Professor Broca. Our regrets, but you must come another day. The professor is busy with his students. But we're students too. We came a long way. The maid shook her head. Monsieur le Professeur has asked for no interruptions during today's dissection. She covered her mouth. Today's work, I mean. Clinton felt an impulse just to push the maid aside and march past her, but then he thought about other people who had agreed to talk to him. Two such unlikely students on this and other missions. He tried one last time, clasping his two hands as if to beg. Mademoiselle, he said, our appointment with the professor is for this exact day and time. We bring him important information to help with his dissection, information about the ventricles, said May. The maid widened her eyes, looking impressed. Nodding, she backed up and allowed them to enter. She led them up two stairways to a room on the third floor, where she opened the door and stood back. Clinton led the way into the room. Sunlight poured in through tall windows with diamond-shaped panes. A man in a white coat stood leaning over the head of the table. On the table, covered by a sheet, lay what looked like a body. Not now, Suzette, said the doctor without looking up. You may bring me my tea in an hour. Clinton and May approached through a smell of rubbing alcohol and something like blood. May said, Professor Broca, we are not Suzette, but students sent from the future to learn from you. At that, the professor lifted his head and turned around. In one hand he held a scalpel, small and sharp, and in the other he grasped a pointed probe. His head was large, with a broad, high forehead. From the future? He echoed. Indeed, don't all our students come from the future? He looked at May. I am glad to see that the future has accepted my ideas about educating females, though I confess surprised to see those of both African and Oriental races engaged in medical study. Not to mention your age. You students of the future must be very clever indeed. So, just quickly, you can see there, they're starting to get some ideas about equality. One of Broca's thoughts is that everyone should be educated for medicine, not just men as it had been, but women as well should start to get educated. There's still some points there that they're not quite sure about equality between different races, which obviously should be there, but back in these days, in talking 150 odd years ago, it wasn't accepted or as accepted, especially in places in Europe, for everyone to get educated. So that's something that thankfully has changed. Thankfully we are much more respectful to everyone nowadays. We're not that far in our studies, Clinton said. Maybe if we just watch and you explain? Yes, said the professor. Step close. You came at the key moment. I have finished sawing around the cranium, I have severed the spinal cord, and I am ready to lift the brain free of its cavern. He stopped. Yes, but in my eagerness, I have neglected to tell you about the case, about why today is so important that you have come from the future to learn about it. He faced them, leaning back against the table and still considering the head of a body that lay on the table. Clinton found himself kind of glad about that. For many years, Professor Brocker said, there has been a man coming to this hospital, a most remarkable man, because although he spoke with no difficulty as a boy and young man, for many years he has lost the ability to produce speech. Now it is not unusual to find a man who cannot, or a man who after a stroke has grown weak in the right side and cannot speak. But this man had no other signs of neurological impairment, nothing else wrong, so his brain was working perfectly, apart from that he couldn't speak. Clinton thought about what it would be like to be unable to speak, and to have to keep all his opinions to himself. Poor guy, he said. Indeed, he could understand speech well enough, that was clear, but he could not articulate speech. He could not make the sounds. He struggled until his face resembled a beat, and yet the only sound that came out was tan, tan, tan. We all called him Tan. Brocker passed a hand over his brow. And I must confess, fond of him as we all were, I am pleased at the chance to dissect his brain. May shuffled her feet. Why him especially? Because for years we anatomists have argued about the structure and function of the brain. Does the whole brain perform together all its functions of thinking and feeling and directing movement? Or is it, as our friends, the phrenologists who study bumps on their heads tell us? Bumps on their head? Clinton asked. You mean like a concussion? Brocker shook his head and continued rapidly. No, I do not mean that. Phrenologists study bony hills and valleys on the head. Each of us has a slightly different skull. Phrenologists think the lumps and bumps are connected to differences in the brain beneath. That raises the question. Does each function of a personality reside in its own certain spot? We have seen hints that speech is housed in one section of the left side of the brain, but all the brains I have examined before for such a defect have come from patients with many different problems following a stroke. Now, at last, I have a specimen with one limited disability, while all the rest functions well. He lifted his tools again. And now, the moment of truth. He turned back to the body. Laying down his instruments, he lifted something from the opened head of the body and laid it in a silver bowl, where he poured water over it. Brocker gave a soft exclamation of pleasure. Just so! Come closer, come closer. He gestured for the children to stand on either side of him, and pointed down at the bowl. The brain lay there, pinkish grey, shaped a bit like a rugby ball but not as big. Its surface was covered in rolling pink ridges that curved like passages of a maze. Like copper that has spilled from the cauldron and hardened in ridges on the sand, Imhotep had said. Brocker pointed to different parts of the brain. Here, you see, where the spinal cord attaches to the bottom of the brain, towards the rear. The cerebellum lies behind the cord, and the cerebrum in front. And you see how the brain is almost split in half, like a walnut, but without fibres connecting the halves deep in the brain. He smiled and tipped the brain so they could see it. And here, look at the frontal lobes. Look at both the right and left. What do you see? They're different, May said slowly. Here, on the left, a couple of folds just back there. It looks kind of chewed up. The rats have been at it, Clinton said, and he felt like he might burst out laughing. Brocker gave him a curious look, and May elbowed him so he knew he'd said something wrong. A dead guy with a wrecked brain isn't supposed to be funny, he thought, but he felt the threat of laughter shake his stomach just the same. But what does it mean? May asked. Paul Brocker stroked his chin. It means, more likely than not, that speech comes from this part of the brain. Not everything about speech, but the ability Tan didn't have. The ability to form sounds into words, because that's what he couldn't do with this part of the brain damaged. He could understand, he could follow directions, but he couldn't speak words. And that means that perhaps everything the brain does, from hearing music to playing the violin to deciding who to vote for, to standing on one foot to recognizing faces, all has its own specific location in the brain. Clinton thought about that for a moment. He rubbed the lump on his hairline where his head had struck the goalkeeper's knee. What about the part of the brain under here? Brocker reached under Clinton's hair. Heavens, what a bump! Did you quarrel with a street boy carrying a brick? Would that make me throw up? Clinton asked. Would it make me get suddenly angry or want to laugh for no reason? We need more specimens to learn the answers, Paul Brocker answered. But have no fear, young man. I refrain from asking to examine your brain. You look too young and healthy for me to pressure you. He smiled benevolently, and Clinton, unable to contain himself, laughed so loudly and so long that Brocker's smile turned uncertain. But wait, May said. How do you know that brains are all set up the same way? Maybe Tan's brain has speech in the left front, but other people have it in the right rear. Brocker answered. Good point. I mentioned that we have hints from other brains that language ability resides in the left in most cases, so our finding is not unexpected. It builds on knowledge that came before it. But you have reason we must examine. But you have reason. We must examine many more brains before reaching a firm conclusion. The door to the dissection room burst open, and Suzette, the maid, stood back to let a swarm of medical students stream into the room and crowd around the anatomist. One carried a bottle of wine. All young men, neatly dressed, they pointed and chattered, jostling May and Clinton to the side. May pointed to the XPA, held her thumb and forefinger close together, and backed towards the door. Clinton followed her into the hallway. Good job, May said. You didn't insult anybody, and you paid attention. That laughing was a little weird, though. Yeah, Clinton said. It kind of just came on me. I felt kind of bad about it. Where do we go next? Suzette the maid came around the corner carrying wine glasses. You two, she scolded. Gossiping at the door like pigeons. I knew you were no students. Now off with you, away. The professor is at work. Clinton's face grew hot, and he opened his mouth to respond, but May shook her head at him, so instead of retorting to Suzette, he opened the door for her. He gave a little bow as she passed through the doorway, carrying wine glasses to the celebrating students. May pointed to the next name on the XPA, Santiago Ramon Yiquial. Clinton shrugged and nodded, and May waved the device in a loop around them. I might have completely said this last name wrong, so anyone who knows how to say that properly, I'm really sorry. So this is all about another of our famous historical figures, which is, I can't remember his name. Broca, Paul Broca, there we go. Now, Paul Broca is from France, and he was what we call an anatomist, which meant that he spent a lot of time looking at bodies, dead bodies, and trying to figure out how they worked. So, in this case, he's got this patient in front of him, Tan, who has died, and what they used to do was they used to take parts of the body apart to see how things worked. So they, in this case, looking at his brain. And over many, many times, this is how we learnt more about our bodies, because they would look at one person and they'd go, okay, here's what we found in this one, let's see if it's the same in this other person. Okay, it is the same, so chances are that's how everyone's looks, and they'll keep practicing and getting more and more of an understanding. When they do the brain, again, they'd look at one brain and they'd say, okay, here's how this one works, let's make a really detailed picture, let's write some notes. Then we'll have a look at a different one. Let's compare them. And for example, in this case with Tan, there was a bit of something that was wrong with the brain. They tried to check what was wrong with it and then go from there. So again, it's kind of learning from anatomy, building things up and going from there. Now, Paul Broca made a big impact of our understanding of the brain. He wasn't the only one. There are people all over Europe who are doing this as well. But he's just one example. And as we now know, some of the language he was using, cerebellum, is language we used when we're talking about our brain today. We also do know there are areas connected to different parts of our brain that do different jobs, so that's quite useful as well. Here is our fact file all about Paul Broca. Paul Broca, 1824 to 1880, was a French physician, anatomist and anthropologist. He is most famous for discovering the area of the human brain involved in physically producing spoken language. So in your brain there's actually a part of it named after him. It's called Broca's area. The son of an army doctor, Broca studied medicine in Paris and eventually rose to become a professor. His areas of study included bones and cartilage, cancers and brain anatomy. His work on where the ability to make language was located in the brain supported the idea that distinct brain areas are involved in specific functions, and this is called localization of function. So again, that idea that this part of your brain controls speech, or this part controls movement. That's all part of his work. Among his other interests, Broca was a strong supporter of Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution. He became a free thinker, once saying, "I would rather be a transformed ape than a degenerate son of Adam." This attitude won him the enmity of the hate of the Catholic Church. Broca wrote on public health and the healthcare of the poor, and he advocated for the education of women. Fascinated by human differences, Broca founded the Paris Society for Anthropology, the study of humanity. He loved to study skulls and bones, and he invented several measurements to measure them. Recognised as a leading French scientist, Broca died at age 56 of a brain hemorrhage. So he worked really hard on the brain, he learnt lots of stuff, and then he eventually died as a result of something in his brain as well. So that's almost kind of ironic ending there. The next person we're looking at is this person here, Santiago Roman y Cajal. Now, that's how I'm going to pronounce it. If you know differently, please do tell me next time you see me. But that's chapter 5, all about the Spanish artist. I'll see you tomorrow.